Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's LinkedIn Live session. My name is Allison Chaney, and I'm an assistant professor of marketing at Fuqua. And I teach market research in the MMS and MQM programs. So my research centers on the machine learning systems that recommend personalized content to basically everyone online. And I've talked to lots of different companies about how they build these systems. So today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between personalization in social media and polarization, particularly political polarization. So the first half of this session, I'll do sort of a brief presentation, and then the second half, it'll be dedicated to question and answer. So if you have any questions, please put them in the comment section as they come to mind, and I'll get to them in the second half of the session. So the way people have consumed media used to be different, and it's changed over time. So it used to be that we would listen on the radio, on television, read newspapers. And so we had a few sources of information that were common to more or less everyone. And so that meant that as a society, people, were kind of tuned into the same sources. But that's different now that we have lots and lots of different channels of information, especially lots of different news outlets, etc. And so, to start, I just want to talk about how personalization works, because the challenge is that, when we have thousands of sources of information or more, I don't have a number exactly, how do you find the relevant content for you, the stuff that you're interested in? And that's what a lot of companies are trying to solve on social media. So the way personalization works is that you're essentially represented in some preference space, and that you're trying to find content as close as possible to you in that preference space. And so the way they figure out where you live is what you click on, what you engage with. And so as you engage with content, it kind of builds that location in preference space. And then, as they make recommendations, they're trying to find things around that location in preference space. So that kind of pushes you towards the representation that they have of you. So what this means is that people can find more relevant content. People can find content that's of interest to them, close to them in preference space. But it also means that people are often exposed to less diversity of content. So they kind of have this narrow world in which they live, and as a repercussion societally, we don't have as many things in common across individuals. So one concrete example of how this is playing out right now is face masks. So currently, there's one segment of the population that believes very strongly in face masks, and there's another segment of the U.S. population that believes that they shouldn't have to wear face masks, or that it's not important. And you'll see lots of different articles online that present different information. And so I did some digging and found a list of these. So I'm going to read some of these headlines to you real quick. So one is, does wearing a face mask pose any health risks? Another is, refusing to wear a face mask is like driving drunk. Okay. Then you have things that are a little bit more extreme, like JetBlue doubles down on kicking family off plane because 2-year-old wasn't wearing a mask. You have things like, is the face mask a muzzle? A brief history. Here's the science behind it. Woman bitten by police for not properly wearing face masks. But then you also get things like mask wearing associated with intelligence, or it makes people look sexy with face masks and things like that. So you get a huge range of information. Some relying on science, some relying on twisting words, some relying on sensational events. And so people are consuming all of these different kinds of content online about face masks. And then you have people that build up opinions about whether or not they should or shouldn't wear a face mask. And so the terms filter bubble and echo chamber have been thrown around a lot with regard to these phenomena. So a filter bubble is essentially you're seeing things inside your preference sphere, right? You have sort of a sphere of preferences, and you're only seeing things kind of within that bubble. And an echo chamber is you're engaging with people that kind of share the same opinions with you. And those are two really related concepts. And what causes this is a mixture of the algorithms that are going into building these recommendation systems, but it's also caused by people essentially self-segregating ideologically, right? So if you compare Twitter and Facebook, for instance, so Facebook, a lot of the content that you're seeing is recommended by the platform, whereas Twitter, you're seeing things more or less chronologically by the people you follow. So there's not really a recommendation system in place per se, but you're engaging with the content from different people. And if you compare those two, you're seeing echo chambers and filter bubbles in both of those contexts, but one has a recommendation system in play and one doesn't really. And so you can see it kind of across platforms, regardless of whether or not they have algorithms. But algorithms do contribute to sort of the homogenizing effect within a filter bubble. Right, so algorithms do play a part. The other thing that's really contributing to this is just partisan extremism. Right, so that's another thing that contributes to polarization, is the partisan extremism. And that's consistent with a lot of political science literature that's kind of delved into these. So again, what algorithms are really contributing isn't the polarization itself, but it's sort of this local homogenization, which is sort of saying that you're seeing similar content to people that share a filter bubble with you. Right. So if I share interests with my mom, then we're more likely to see the same news articles online. Right. Whereas if I don't, if we're, completely separate, then we're probably going to be seeing different things. Right. So you have a local homogenization. People, that subscribe to your same ideologies are seeing the same sort of things. And people that don't are seeing a separate set of things that other people in their ideology are seeing. Okay. And then we also see kind of this rich get richer effect, where within a filter bubble, some articles will become, even more popular because they're kind of close to the center of those preferences, if that makes sense. And so then, everyone who I don't know, likes Huskies, let's do that so that it's politically neutral. So say there's a filter bubble around people who like Huskies, and then there are certain pictures of Huskies that will become extremely popular to everyone who shares that interest, as opposed to globally popular across everyone. So then the question is, what can we do as a society and as individuals? So people are working on algorithmic solutions to kind of help with this, to help people decrease this self-segregation. But there's a limit to how much we can do, right? Because it's often imposed by the users of these platforms themselves. Like on Facebook, you can choose to unfollow people. There's no amount of algorithms will stop people from doing that unless you kind of have a big brother mentality, which I think people are opposed to. They'll stop using the platform, right? So as individuals, we need to kind of combat it ourselves, because essentially political science has shown that having lots of smaller news outlets isn't actually contributing to polarization, or at least there's not firm evidence. The polarization is actually confined to small, highly involved and influential individuals. So it's a segment of the population that is sort of becoming polarized, and that in general the public isn't being polarized. It's just those political elite or engaged individuals that are becoming polarized. So where most of the polarization exists, it's actually related to certain hot button issues that we kind of engage with, or these sensitive issues, like masks, right? It's very timely, but down the line, people will, won't really care eventually, one way or another, because the issue will have resolved. So at the end of the day, recommendation systems can increase our perception or our awareness of of polarization. So again, these systems can increase our awareness of polarization, but they don't actually contribute to it directly, or at least there's not a lot of evidence to indicate that. So as individuals, what we can do right now is actively try and get outside our filter bubbles. We can try and understand others, and that includes understanding, friends, colleagues. It can include trying to understand segments like in your businesses that you may not be catering to currently. We can dig deeper into our sources of information to try and understand where these sources are coming from. And as and in social media, you can actually control what content is recommended to you in some extent when you go into these personalized settings. So on Facebook and Twitter, you can kind of tinker with the settings that what content is recommended to you. And that's actually a really interesting experience. If you haven't done that, I encourage you to go try and figure out how to edit your personalization settings and see what tags or other information are used to represent you, because that can be really enlightening, not just as an individual consumer, but as a business person as well, as you're learning about how these systems work and how you can use them in your own professional life. And then I guess another thing is that as managers and business owners, we can do our best to protect our employees and our customers, right? And be firm but kind in our policies, and really try and understand the full spectrum that people come from as they engage with us, right? So I think that's the little presentation I had. I'm happy to take questions. So one question that I have is, if I search for things or click on things that I'm not really interested in, does that help the algorithms learn that I want more diverse content? And to that, I would say not really. So this is something that people have actually told me in the past. They say, oh, well, like I click on things to kind of confuse the algorithm, to kind of shake things up. And I would argue that probably doesn't work, just based on my understanding of these algorithms, because really what's happening is that you have a representation of preferences, and people are behaving noisily anyway, right? So you can imagine, just sort of there's some error around the way they're usually behaving. So if you're kind of clicking on things randomly, that's just increasing sort of the noise, sort of the noise to signal ratio, and so they still finds the same signal if you're kind of clicking truly randomly, and so that shouldn't really impact anything that the algorithms. I mean, it might impact things slightly. It might actually, decrease how relevant things are. That wouldn't surprise me, but I don't think it's going to increase diversity in any way. That's not going to give you different kinds of content per se. It'll just give you content that's sort of in a different location, if that makes sense. Another question is, what is the impact of turning off personalization settings? And to that, I think there what happens is you often get sort of a recommendation system. Well, the content that will be recommended to you will essentially be the most popular. It depends really strongly on what the platform is doing under the hood, but oftentimes things will they'll just recommend whatever's most popular, right? And so by turning off the personalization settings, you're kind of converging to whatever the largest segment of the platform is using. So if you have a very liberal platform in general with a smaller segment of conservative users, then the content you'll be recommended will be more representative of the largest segment there. Yeah. So another note related to that actually is, so I talked about preference spaces and how you're kind of represented as a location, like a single location in preference space. And so that, so there are some systems that don't necessarily use that exact mechanism. I think that's pretty common. That's sort of the most popular. And in other platforms, they use sort of like a tag-based system. So instead of saying, I'm represented at this point in space, instead I'll have a set of tags that represent me. So I like dogs, I like gardening, I like whatever. I think that's still pretty similar in behavior to that point-based system, but it's a little bit different. All right, here's another question. So assuming that political views are distributed normally, one would expect to hear more from the majority of people in the middle, yet that doesn't appear to be the case. Is there an explanation for why fewer moderate political views are heard? That's a really good question. That is kind of, it is more on the political science end of things. So I think I think what ends up happening there is at the elite levels, there's actually, I have a paper on that. So there's a 2008 paper by Fiorenina and Abrams called Political Polarization in the American Public. And what that basically says is that the public itself is not polarized, so the public is very moderate, but the elite is polarized. And so the elite, the politicians essentially are polarized. And so that article talks a little bit more about that. But based on what, my knowledge of the political system, I think some of that actually has to do with the way primaries work. So if you have a very blue state or a very red state, like it's just, pretty universally, what happens is that the primaries kind of decide the victor, right? So if you have a blue state, then you have your Democratic primary, and whoever's nominated in the Democratic primary essentially becomes the winner, right? And so, but the only people that vote in the primary are people that are more extreme, right? And so then in those, pretty universally blue or red states, things are decided by a more extreme segment of the population. And so that is, I think, fundamentally why we see extreme, more and more extreme cases in politics, or at least that's one explanation as to why that. So that question was from David Baker, 1990, Fuqua alum out of Philly. So yay, Philly. I spent a fair amount of time in the Philly area, so good for that. Okay, here's another question. What do you think about our predisposition to click on the trending topics on social media? This is not a direct recommendation, but in a way nudging users to specific content. So that, what do I think about it? So clickbait, right? This is clickbait. So, when we click on trending topic, that's not necessarily representative of our interests. It just represents, I think there's kind of two things that play into our willingness to click on things. One is sort of our desire for information, and another is a desire for entertainment. And when we click on trending topics, sometimes we're satisfying our desire for entertainment rather than information. And so that's, it's again not necessarily representative of where we are in preference space, but it kind of biases the systems that come into play. And as it relates to nudging users to specific content, so I think there's been an interesting post. I forget the name of the guy who posted it on Twitter, but he's fantastic. And so he described recommendation systems as kind of two things: building a model and building a system that actually makes the recommendations. And so if you've ever taken an art class, building the model is kind of like sketching the big circles that make the wireframe of what's going on. It's like, this is the structure that we're going to be using to make these recommendations. And then if you're actually going to draw a picture, all of the fine details are kind of building the system. And so, when we're talking about, nudging to trending topics, that big sketch of the system is essentially just, what's popular, right? And then all of the details are how it's implemented and deployed. And those details are actually really important to getting a system right. So for instance, one small detail is that, how often do you reassess what's trending, right? If you're reassessing it very rapidly, then that's going to give you a very different notion of what's trending than if you're reassessing at sort of like a yearly scale, right? Those are going to be two very different things. And that's often considered to be a detail, but those details are actually really important to creating these nudges. Exactly. So that question that I just talked about, that I'm going to massacre this, I'm so sorry. Vireshwar Saha, also a 2020 Fuqua alum right here in Durham, so yay. Okay, so another question. What about sensitive topics where only certain views are acceptable and others are withheld? This has a profound influence on bystanders and skews views abnormally. So this is interesting. I think, and that's Murali, again, I'm so sorry, Krishnamurthy, 2010 Fuqua alum out of Minneapolis. So that, that's really challenging. So I think, again, that gets to the notion of how these systems are implemented, because sometimes these systems have censoring in place, essentially, where views will be tagged as, not factually accurate, or like prohibited in some way. So that, those views obviously won't be represented, or they'll be kind of pushed to platforms that don't have those mechanisms in play. So, I was kind of talking about things in a single platform system, but what ends up happening is that as soon as you have a platform that will reject an ideology or like make something unacceptable, then users or people who hold those views will often move off that platform to discuss that, to get that information. And so that actually increases, the proliferation of different sources of information, different social media platforms. So that, and it's a challenge, right? Because, we believe in freedom of speech as a nation, but then there's also, issues of, there's imposing morals on people as well. Okay, does using a VPN service inhibit preference algorithms? And I believe, okay, so that's from David Stevens, also a Fuqua alum out of DC, Baltimore area. So it depends, probably not. So using a VPN server, it depends on how the things are being implemented again. So if you have something using cookies, then your cookie is going to be there regardless of whether or not you're using a VPN, right? If you have anything with a login, again, like it's going to just use your login information, and they'll have some sort of other tagging system. The only time a VPN would possibly impact things, or a tunneling system would possibly impact things, would be is if the personalization algorithms are being done based on location. Right. So if they're using the location of your IP address, then that can impact these personalization. So if you're if you're tunneling into Europe to watch Tour de France or whatever, then you might see content that is, to whatever location in Europe. So you might, or, what's recommended to you might be biased in that direction. But again, that only impacts platforms that use location and IP information in that regard. Anything that uses a cookie or login information, that's going to not have an impact there. Yep. All right. So please, I'm more than happy to answer additional questions if anyone else has some. So I'll wait a minute to see if more come in. Okay. Here's another one. Do the algorithm work differently for the same person depending on location in the world? I feel this is true because I travel a lot and notice this phenomenon. VPN can help a bit, but not sure. So again, it depends on what's being done in terms of platform. There's also impact based on regulation, right? So in California, there's different regulation than in the rest of the US, and also in Europe. There's regulation on how cookies are used, essentially. And so And then there are also certain locations in the world that don't have access to certain services. So like you might not be able to access Google in China, right? And so then anything that relies on Google-based advertising might be impacted there. So there are a bunch of these smaller things that can impact. So I think, so I wouldn't say that it's the algorithm per se, it's kind of the system. So you have, different contingencies based on what information is available. And that question was from Ian Helfich out of the Atlantic. Oh, no, this is a new question. Ian Helfich out of the Atlantic area. Does the algorithmic approach pick up on populism and general populist rhetoric? Again, I think it depends on the algorithm. Like there are lots of different algorithms at play. And I think to some degree, yes. It really depends on what's being implemented, how kind of detailed the algorithm is at representing individuals. Typically, yes, there is some sort of notion of, what's popular, but I wouldn't say it's populist in the political science sense. But yes, it can definitely pick up on those signals if you engineer it accordingly. Another question before we wrap up, besides banning or canceling different tech companies, is there any policy initiative to mitigate the damage of algorithms on our society? So I do want to reiterate that it's not really the algorithms that are causing all of the damage. And that part of it is just the fact that we have all of this information available and that people are talking about it. So again, if you looked at Twitter, right? Twitter is, definitely contributing to polarization in our society. But that's not necessarily the algorithm, that's just the platform, right? Because there's not really a recommendation system, there's not really an algorithm in play there. It's just whatever is, happening, and you have some notion of trending, but I think most people just engage with the people that they're following. And so you really need to kind of encourage people to follow different people. And then could we reduce polarization by having the algorithms tweaks to show us ideas, views outside our filter bubbles? Absolutely, yeah, that we can absolutely do. And there's work that I've done. I haven't published anything on it, but I've been doing some work on that. Other people are doing some work on that. So the answer is yes, but the question is whether or not people like them. Right? There are kind of three parties of interest here. There's users of the platform who want content that's interesting to them. There's the platforms themselves who want, people to engage with them. And then there's sort of the public, like, good, right? And the problem is that, that third interest, like it's hard to figure out, like, what is the public good? And then once we figure it out, we need to convince both the users and the firms that they want to act in the interest of the public good. So I think like GDPR and California's latest regulation are sort of steps in that direction where users have to be able to understand how personalization works. All right, so I need to wrap up, but I do see a potential for California privacy regulations to impact the rest of the US. I think that we'll probably end up going in a direction like that. All right. All right, just to wrap up, thank you so much everyone for joining me. This has been a lot of fun. So please tune in again next week at 12:30 p.m. Eastern time for another session in Fuqua's LinkedIn Live. So next week, finance professor Jillian Grennan will be discussing her research on how artificial intelligence will change the future of work. All right, thank you again.